Yep, that's me. You're probably wondering how I ended up in this situation. I want to start this video off by saying if you went into or are planning to go into the Callisto Protocol expecting some sort of clone or spiritual successor to Dead Space, you already missed the point. This false consensus of it being considered as such for no real reason other than the director who is tied to the project makes it inevitable to not bring up Dead Space in some capacity. But don't expect an hour-long rambling about how a game that was marketed by the creators of Dead Space as something quite different from Dead Space is actually quite different from Dead Space. Shocking, I know. I found the Callisto Protocol disappointing for other reasons. My initial impressions with the game were essentially boiled down to the Sphere Hunters review almost bullet point for bullet point, to the point where I even thought about dropping Callisto off and replaying Signalis instead. The weird part is that I don't agree with that review anymore, or any other review for that matter, no offense, because even though I went into this game not expecting Dead Space, on my first playthrough I was still subconsciously playing it as if it were Dead Space. And I think that's what all the first-in-line reviews got spectacularly wrong. If I had rushed out my review 4 weeks ago just to be the first on the YouTube search engine, I'd have gotten the same things wrong on my review. That's simply the reality of being a content creator. It's always about who gets first to the finish line, not who's the first to get it right. While I can understand that's how it works and that it's a real problem, I refuse to be part of that problem. Ever since this game came out, I've played through the Callisto Protocol about 4.5 times. I did get the Platinum Trophy for this one, so consider this to be one of those review after 100% type of videos with 100% chances of spoiling the crap out of it. My opinion on the Callisto Protocol has changed so much that it's as if the game I'm playing now is entirely different to the one that I first booted up. You might be tempted to boil it down to simply sunk cost fallacy, but I'm someone who enjoys replaying games with or without a new game plus. I just like giving games the chance that they truly deserve. I don't have to defend anything. If I didn't think it would get better after that, I would not have replayed it. I could have just sold my copy and got compensated for all the hassle. It's that simple. So let's address the elephant in the room first, shall we? Is the Callisto Protocol as bad as the internet makes it out to be? No. But were players right to be furious about the poor optimization at launch? Yeah. Listen, here's the thing, alright? When a consumer commits to the full AAA price tag, or quadruple A as they call it these days, whether it's €60 or $60 for last gen, $70 for current gen, and let's not even forget all the microtransaction pools that companies swim in these days, does it really seem that unreasonable to you that people expect a game to at least drop a patch that fixes the most debilitating issues at launch? You would think this would be the minimum requirement, not to mention common courtesy, but apparently not. I want to make it clear that the purpose of this video is not to preach to you why you should or should not pay that amount for the Callisto Protocol. As far as I'm concerned, if you want the next best AAA game, maybe wait for a while and get it on sale. But if you're a walking survival horror Wikipedia page like I am that wants more AAA survival horror games, then stick around for this video and make your own choice at the end. So make yourself at home. Grab a snack, maybe a nice hot cappuccino. Now's as good a time as any to chill out as we talk about something we all love: video games. And since we're on the subject of game purchases and all that, digital sales are more popular than ever now. And if you're not a PC player who's been able to use the 2-hour refund policy on Steam, then you probably owe it to yourself to truly understand all that Callisto has to offer to take in every last ounce of enjoyment from it. As for myself, what do I think about all this? I think it sucks how things turned out the way they did, but that's the AAA industry for you. It's that weird zone where design by committee and utter disappointment usually collide. That being said, for all the AAA cliches that Callisto falls back on, this game also goes all in on a few gameplay ideas that some players in the survival horror community were never going to get on board with. That kind of whiplash has no doubt played a part in how controversial the game turned out, but that being said, I think Callisto Protocol, for what it's worth, is one of the most refreshing AAA survival horror games in recent memory, specifically because of the risks that it takes. I think we need people like Glen Schofield making more survival horror games. We need games that take bold risks like the Callisto Protocol. In this video, I will be going into detail as to what the game set out to achieve, what its intentions were, and then throughout the different video chapters I'll give my opinion on where it succeeded and where it did not. I should also clarify clarify that the footage you will see throughout this video is from 2 separate playthroughs and builds, with the difficulty set to maximum security on both of them. All of the footage is captured on a PS4 Pro running at around 1080p 30 frames per second when it's stable. The footage with Jacob running around with the retro skin is on patch 1.03 or 4, I think. I'm not sure which one, but it was the 3rd patch they released, I'm sure about that much. The playthrough with Jacob's default outfit is running on patch 1.08, and it offers plenty of quick fixes that, while not perfect, definitely iron out some gameplay kinks. I will, however, take a moment just now to show you a snippet of the game running on version 1.0 to see how it looks without any patches. And oh boy. You can get precious all you want about owning physical media, but coming from someone who also likes to buy physical media, the 1.0 version you own on the disc is about as useful as a compass in Antarctica. Without any patches, this game runs like a slideshow, and those fire effects are giving me Cyberpunk 2077 flashbacks all over again. This game will forever live and die on its patches. Some of my regular viewers on the channel already know this, but if you are new here, first things first, consider liking the video and talk to me in the comments. Let me know what you think of this game. Maybe even, I don't know, press the subscribe button? Do it. And second, I consider Glen Schofield to be one of the largest contributors to the survival horror genre. There's Shinji Mikami, the godfather of survival horror, right at the top, and then there are the runner-ups who are willing to carry that torch and take it in bold and new directions. Glen Schofield is one of those people. I have been listening to Schofield's interviews ever since he showed Dead Space 1 at E3 2008, and that same passion and enthusiasm he's had for video games back then is still present in all of the interviews for the Callisto Protocol, including the Ars Technica documentary he made about Dead Space before CP was even announced. Love or hate his work, at the end of the day, you just know that this guy just wants to make some damn good horror games. And last but not least, even though I consider Dead Space 2 to be the best Dead Space game and one of the best survival horror games of all time, don't even try to argue with me about that, I strongly believe it could have never turned out to be as exceptional as it did if it wasn't already standing on the shoulders of the giant that is Dead Space 1. Longtime fans of the genre already know this, but for those who are still getting used to it all, brand new survival horror IPs that are just starting out have a hard time swinging for the fences, and more often than not, they drop the ball pretty hard. Dead Space 1 was not one of them. This game was an absolute home run the minute it launched. It gained a massive cult following over the past decade, and pairing those overhyped expectations with the poorly optimized launch of the Callisto Protocol, it was obvious that it was doomed to live in the shadow of what came before it. That being said, the Callisto Protocol is a survival horror game that subverts many of the tired stereotypes associated with the subgenre, especially on YouTube. The unreasonable expectations of things that were never promised for Callisto should tell you all you need to know about how little real understanding there seems to be when it comes to the survival horror genre and what the real criteria that defines it even is. Glen Schofield and his team at Striking Distance must have gotten more conniptions in these past few weeks than Hawk ever did in all of Dark Souls 3.
Gives me conniptions.
Because those of us who kept a close eye on the development cycle of this game are well aware that the Callisto Protocol is not a spiritual successor to Dead Space, it's a spiritual predecessor. And if one really can't fight the urge to compare it to other survival horror games, CP is more of a spiritual successor to 2014's The Evil Within than anything else. And even then, the similarities begin and end in terms of legacy and critical reception, not much else. The similarities to Dead Space are so few and superficial that I could list them right now and they won't even amount to 5% of the entire review. You've got the over-the-shoulder camera, hardly unique to Dead Space, you have enemies spawning out of vents, you have a ton of obnoxious and redundant jump scares, you're thrown into a sci-fi horror setting that's also hardly unique to Dead Space, and you have the return of the almighty stomp and the seamless HUD. That last one was literally the only idea that was still unique to Dead Space until now, but with Callisto's release, even that aspect isn't original to Dead Space anymore. Some other minor things like the bloody writings on the wall targeting specific body parts and the use of a telekinesis tool return, but these are more like homages than anything else, and they aren't really all that functionally identical to what came before. Same concepts, but different executions. So regardless of everyone saying Callisto's just a rehash of Dead Space, It's really not even close to the truth.
We made this one up. It's a made-up tale.
So instead, let's go over the shockingly similar parallels between the Callisto Protocol and The Evil Within, and I have two reasons for doing so. Not only do the parallels between these two games provide all the context that is missing from the comparisons to Dead Space, it's also puzzling how I've yet to see someone in the survival horror niche point them out when talking about this game, especially considering that most of them have already done reviews/retrospectives on The Evil Within, and I've yet to make mine. I don't understand how these parallels even went under the radar to begin with. I say it's puzzling because most of the disappointment that most reviewers had, and even the disappointment that I initially had about the game, the answers pertaining to where things went wrong can all be traced by observing these parallels. But in order to do so, we need to go all the way back to the year 2005, to a little underground, hidden horror gem that obviously nobody's ever heard of, Resident Evil 4. The marketing phrase redefining survival horror is being thrown around ad nauseum as of late, but the reality is that Resident Evil 4 was really the last game that took the industry and the survival horror genre and shook them upside down. By some miracle, after so many different builds of the game that just were not working out, RE4 somehow turned into Shinji Mikami's magnum opus. Everyone realized the final product was so ahead of its time that, against the wish of Mikami-san, Capcom started developing ports to other platforms outside of the GameCube. This led to Mikami-san's decision to depart Capcom in 2006, right after completing the game God Hand. Fast forward to 2010 and he founded his own studio, Tango Gameworks. The studio then got acquired by ZeniMax, owners of Bethesda. In 2014, Bethesda would then publish Mikami-san's first game under Tango Gameworks, and it would be his first survival horror game he had made since Resident Evil 4, and that game was The Evil Within. The Evil Within had many similar problems to the Callisto Protocol. It was so obsessed with pushing the creative boundaries of what survival horror games could be that it seems to have forgotten all about not fixing what wasn't broken. There was a heavy emphasis on marketing and big names tied to the project, including Shinji Mikami himself, and a handful of promising actors lending their voices to the characters. In hindsight, it seemed like all the budget went into the advertising and then used what little was left to actually work on the game instead of the other way around. The critical reception at launch was pretty divisive. Performance issues and poor optimization across all platforms, pacing issues, ambitious gameplay mechanics that weren't consistent enough to prevent player frustration, cheap deaths and an over-reliance on traps to serve as tension and jump scares, and a pretty interesting story buried so far underneath its artsy-fartsiness that the game required additional DLC to wrap it all up and remind you that there is a story and a reason for everything that's happening. And I'm sure plenty of you remember this. At launch, you could not turn off the letterboxing and the black bars on the screen. That was only added after people complained about how annoying it was and took away from the experience rather than added to it, which I most definitely agreed with. That was Shinji Mikami's timeline, but now let's look back at Glen Schofield's. Let's rewind the clock a bit, back to 2008. You're probably wondering at this point, what's so special about this year? Good question, I'm glad you asked. 2008 was a year unlike any other, where even huge publishers like EA and Ubisoft took risks, experimenting with lots of unique ideas for the time and greenlighting brand new IPs. Some paid off, and some did not. 2008 was wild for video games. Fallout 3, Alone in the Dark 5, Far Cry 2, Left 4 Dead, Silent Hill Homecoming, Spider-Man Web of Shadows, Tomb Raider Underworld, and so many more. But the two arguably most innovative games to have come out that year were both published by EA. Mirror's Edge offered a unique experience that was both flawed and refreshing. To say it was a novel thing at the time would be an understatement, single-handedly proving that the first-person perspective has more to offer beyond the typical first-person shooter. Ranged combat was still an option, but an entirely skippable one. First-person parkour was a total game-changer for the FPS genre and even platformers. Games like Dying Light, Titanfall 2, and even something like Dishonored probably would have never happened if it wasn't for Mirror's Edge. That was one of two sleeper hits that came out from EA in 2008, but the second one became a survival horror juggernaut. Dead Space is one of the most, if not the most, immersive survival horror game ever made. When developing this game, the goal was simple. We are making Resident Evil 4 in space. Those aren't my words, check this out.
Some of my influences to make Dead Space from the game industry was definitely the Resident Evil series. And Resident Evil 4 had just come out when we were starting on this game. And Resident Evil 4 was actually one of the things I would say to the team is we're going to make Resident Evil in space. And you got it right away.
I find it really funny whenever someone acknowledges Dead Space as a survival horror game and denies Resident Evil 4 of that same title in the same breath, even though it has been officially acknowledged that Dead Space took RE4 as the main inspiration and they just built on top of it. By that logic, it's either both games are survival horror or neither of them are. And let's face it, that latter option is out of the question, but it is funny how the narrative never seems to be consistent. Dead Space came out with innovations to gameplay immersion that most games today don't even care to attempt. That innovation came in the form of obsession with diegetic detail. Dead Space does not have a traditional heads-up display to speak of. All of the necessary information is part of the world itself and part of Isaac's engineering suit. Instead of a health gauge and a mana bar, Isaac's vital signs and telekinesis meter would show up on the spine of his spacesuit. And it's not unique to his suit either. This is just how people on the Ishimura lived, how they kept track of what happens to their peers and colleagues somewhere as dangerous as outer space. I could go on and on about the obsession to detail, how the ship is so believable, all the way from the environments to the ship's layout and even the weapons simply being mining tools that Isaac simply improvised with to survive. The point is, Dead Space is hailed as a masterpiece for a reason, and it's because it took Resident Evil 4, the most innovative survival horror game at the time, and then it tweaked that revolutionary gameplay to create a sci-fi world that was far more grounded in reality than Resident Evil ever was, which for a game set in outer space, that's a monumental achievement. Shortly after Dead Space and that huge success, in 2010 Glen Schofield left EA to form Sledgehammer Games, and proceeded to work on Call of Duty for the better part of a decade. It was almost as if he disappeared off the face of the earth. Fast forward to 2019 and Glen Schofield shows up out of nowhere with an utmost fascinating interview conducted by Ars Technica. The timing of the interview suggests that it was conducted with the purpose of planting a seed for some big and imminent announcement, and surely enough, that is exactly what happened. It was evident that Schofield's relations with EA went south after Dead Space 1. Why else would you leave something as great as Dead Space behind? It was clear that the survival horror space is where he truly got to flex his creative muscles, and that same year, Schofield and other members of the disbanded Visceral Game Studio opened up Striking Distance Studios under the publisher Krafton. You seeing the parallels yet? We're just getting started. Fast forward to the 2020 Game Awards and lo and behold, Glen Schofield's next survival horror game suddenly became real, the Callisto Protocol. A sci-fi survival horror game set in a dangerous prison on an even more dangerous moon. For those of you wondering why Callisto is a spiritual predecessor and not a successor, this was actually the original idea for Dead Space, and it had a completely different name, Rancid Moon.
Started with Glen Schofield, the EP. He had a vision for a game that he was all excited about, and he wanted to do a prison game in space, and I think he wanted to even call it, Moon Wars or something.
No, it wasn't called Moon Wars. It was, Rancid Moon, that's right, yes. It was sort of like Escape from New York on another planet.
However, EA didn't like the whole prison setting, and so Visceral Games had to reimagine the whole concept, changing the setting to the Ishimura space station and the name to Dead Space. Initially intended to be a single-player story tied to the PUBG universe, Striking Distance would eventually announce that Callisto's ties to PUBG had all been cut off. As that December release date approached, the advertising for Callisto just went through the roof. Schofield and even his star-studded cast comprised of Josh Duhamel, Karen Fukuhara, Sam Witwer, and plenty of other well-established names in the biz were front and center in the promotional material. A dedicated developer diary series called Mastering Horror was also releasing episodically in the weeks leading up to the release date. The hype was just out of control. Then the game came out and all hell broke loose. Once again, it seemed like all the budget went into the advertising and then used what little was left to actually work on the game instead of the other way around. The critical reception at launch was pretty divisive. Performance issues and poor optimization across all platforms, pacing issues, ambitious gameplay mechanics that weren't consistent enough to prevent player frustration, cheap deaths and an over-reliance on drawn-out death scenes and jump scares, and an interesting story buried so far underneath its artsy-fartiness that the game will most likely require additional DLC to wrap it all up and remind you that there actually is a story. And back when it launched, the game also had obnoxiously long animations for healing, modular weapon swapping, and even upgrading items at the workbench. These issues were only fixed after people complained about how annoying they were and took away from the experience rather than adding to it. If this is starting to sound like deja vu, it's because it is. This whole paragraph is literally a rehash of The Evil Within, just with a few names and characteristics swapped to fit the Callisto Protocol's development story. As the philosopher George Santayana once said, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. and oh boy, talk about a blast from the past. That concludes the interesting parallels I wanted to draw before the real review starts, so without further ado, let's begin. The story of the Callisto Protocol centers around Jacob Lee, a space pilot working for the United Jupiter Company delivering cargo between the moons of Europa and Callisto. No questions asked. The game opens with Jacob and his business partner Max about to travel from Callisto back to Europa. A news broadcast reveals some sort of devastating attack on Europa. The female survivor walking down the streets is revealed to be Denny Nakamura, the leader of the Outer Way, a group that is being accused of orchestrating the attack. The broadcast is then switched off and the game wastes little to no time to establish the tension between Jacob and Max, who clearly has taken issue with Jacob's deliver packages first, ask questions later attitude. On a first playthrough, it does feel as if crucial information is being artificially omitted to keep things interesting and mysterious, but in retrospect, this scene actually does manage to convey a lot with very little. The game isn't really withdrawing important details just because. It's more so that Jacob and Max are withdrawing themselves from discussing the harsh realities of their ongoing situation. Jacob doesn't want to confront Max about the questionable morals of their job, and Max spares his breath from rehashing things over and over to Jacob that are implied to have already been said long before the game even started. The conversation ends before it even begins, and Jacob heads to the cargo hold for a maintenance check. To his surprise, the ship had been boarded by the Outer Way. In a failed attempt to eject the unwelcome hitchhikers and show the Outer Way, the Outer Way, Jacob and Max crash back onto Callisto. Jacob survives the crash, but Max does not. Captain Leon Ferris of Black Iron Prison scoops Jacob out of the shipwreck. The invader, Denny Nakamura herself, is seen apprehended by the captain, and for some inexplicable reason, Jacob gets apprehended as well. He insists of having done nothing wrong, but as the conversation with Max would suggest, Jacob may not be the saint he pretends to be. Speaking of saints and whatnot, here's a fun fact about Jacob. Isaac Clarke from Dead Space is named after two of the most influential science fiction authors, Isaac Asimov and Arthur C. Clarke. I'm not sure to whom the surname Lee is dedicated to, but apparently Schofield named the character Jacob because in the Bible, Jacob is the son of Isaac. Just thought it was a cool little detail worth sharing. It turns out the staff at Black Iron Prison have questionable morals of their own. Jacob is thrust into this hellish dungeon and the first thing they do to him is drill an actual literal life gauge tightly screwed into the back of his neck. The prison refers to it as the core, and ironically, the first thing this gauge shows is no signs of life, as the surgery kills Jacob in the process. Dr. Caitlin Mahler, who is responsible for this surgery and plays a pivotal role later in the game, resuscitates Jacob with a health injector. A viral outbreak coincidentally occurs the moment he's thrown into a cell. In an act of desperation, he teams up with an inmate, Elias, and their escape plan requires freeing another inmate out of a maximum security sector known as the Shoe. That inmate turns out to be Danny, and the three must set aside their differences and even put him to good use in their attempt to escape off of Callisto. Naturally, as you'd expect in a survival horror game, nothing is ever that simple and something always goes horribly wrong. With no spacecraft left to escape with, the only way out of Callisto isn't up and out, but down and under. It's a pretty common trope of escaping in survival horror games. The only way out is in. As previously stated, all the footage you're seeing in this review is from a PlayStation 4 Pro. Every review that I've watched so far has either praised the PS5 version or straight up tore the PC and Xbox versions a new one, but no one ever seems to bring up the PS4 version, which is odd considering that it's a cheaper version of the same game, and for how good it looks, it runs also surprisingly well. And for a 9-year-old machine, that's impressive. Well, technically PS4 Pro is 6 years old, but you get my point. It's still a PS4 and it's still an ancient-ass machine by modern standards. I cannot stress enough why that is so important. This is a multi-platform cross-gen title that somehow stutters far less on PS4 than what I've seen on PC. And at times it even looks almost as graphically impressive as The Last of Us Part 2, which is a first-party title, not a third-party one. And that's an important distinction. Callisto is not consistently on that level, not even close, but the fact that it can even be comparable at some points is astonishing in and of itself. The only games on PS4 that ever managed to get to that level, I can count them on one hand. That being said, I don't want you, the viewer, to get the wrong impression here. The Callisto Protocol does make The Evil Within look like it runs like a train wreck in comparison, However, that's not exactly setting the bar high. I'd say that with the added patches, Callisto is a far smoother and consistent experience, but there's a lot of presentational aspects that I found to be disappointing. I know the nickname Stutter Protocol has been thrown around more than a metalhead in a mosh pit lately, but on PS4 this should be called the Loading Protocol because this thing takes upward of 1 whole minute to load every single time. For a game that takes pride in making the player die often, I don't understand how anyone thought this would be a good idea. Just to put things into perspective, Bloodborne, a game where you die just as often, if not more, had loading screens that lasted between 20 and 30 seconds and then it got patched to load in just 10. That was a game changer, it motivated me to get better and it's why I haven't gotten enough of playing Souls-likes for the past 7 years. But conversely with Callisto, loading times have gotten longer and longer with every new patch. What's even worse is that most of the time the game still doesn't finish loading up all of the textures, the lights, and the objects. What's even the point of staring at a white logo and a blank screen for a whole minute if it's still not gonna load the entire scene? Anyway, it's frustrating, but it is what it is. It's possible there was no better alternative solution and maybe the other option was to abandon last gen altogether. I'm glad that didn't happen, but maybe it should have. I've gotten really good at this game so I can put up with many of its flaws, but for someone brand new to survival horror, this is gonna make paying the full AAA price feel like a big mistake. I suspect this will be a huge accessibility barrier for some, but for those who don't mind overcoming these hurdles, there's a lot to enjoy here. Let's start with one of my favorite features in this game, and that is photo mode. I love messing around with this stuff. I've taken dozens upon dozens of awesome photos. But here's the thing. Even though Callisto has some of the coolest photos I've ever taken in a video game, the photo mode options themselves are a bit lacking. One thing that immediately stands out to me is the lack of a tilt image option. I cannot tell you how many times I've snapped the perfect shot in the middle of combat, only to then realize the picture will not look right unless it's angled at a tilt. Another thing that bugged me a bit is the absence of fine-tuning options, like saturation levels and even vignettes, because that's another thing. The blacks in the game are simply not dark enough. You could crank up the contrast to max settings and the blacks are still gray and you just end up with an ugly saturation plastered over the image. It's such a strange thing. Everyone seems to have been annoyed by this in the RE2 remake and I wasn't, but in Callisto it gave me an absolute headache. To be fair, Resident Evil 2 didn't have a photo mode and so maybe that's why I didn't find it distracting. Although now that I think of it, a game that good looking not having a photo mode is the real sin. There's no option to hide enemies or supporting characters like Elias or Danny in photo mode, and there's also no option to place logos in different parts of the image. It always just pops up in the bottom right corner. Maybe I've been spoiled by incredible photo modes from Sony's first party titles, and to be fair, Callisto's decent photo mode is a super welcome feature, but I just can't help but wish it just went that extra mile, you know? I would not be so critical of this stuff if the game was not good enough to deserve a better photo mode. When everything falls just in place, the game simply looks phenomenal. Let's talk about the environments and art direction. Black Iron Prison has some of the coolest industrial environments you'll ever find in survival horror. Industrial imagery within the horror genre usually consists of these claustrophobic red and brown color tints to fit with the motif of rust and decay. The Otherworld in Silent Hill would be a prime example. But here, these functionally similar environments like the prisons, sewers, and factories showcase a really unusual aesthetic choice. Browns and reds still appear here and there, and the overall aesthetic remains consistent enough until the end, but Callisto is a lot more playful with the colors that it uses. The prison has a yellow-gray dual-tone color scheme and even uses some blues and greens to accentuate itself. Speaking of yellow, you will notice there's an abundance of spiked walls wherever you seem to go. I'll talk more about how they work in the gameplay section, but in terms of world building, they can feel out of place and immersion breaking at times, because until you get some answers, they feel super video gamey, like the designers just put them there without rhyme or reason and just ran with it. Eventually, their purpose does seem to make enough sense, although to be perfectly frank, the game could have benefited strongly from a more frugal and strategic approach to how and where they get placed in the environments. The surface of Callisto looks far more bland in terms of color variety, and it sure lives up to its reputation as the Dead Moon. It is possible that the prison sports a bit of color variety to lessen the stress in the work environment. Mental health problems can arise when spending long periods of time without sunlight or looking at vibrant colors, which the Moon of Callisto has neither of, and would explain why so much of the prison is in yellow, a color that is known to alleviate stress. The outer environments of Callisto are smothered in sheets of snow, hopeless endless mist and an unforgiving cold. It gives this impression that Black Iron Prison is somehow a more merciful place to be trapped in than the outside. It's tragic, ironic, and I dig it. That being said, there's something truly majestic beyond the dull grays, pitch blacks, and frozen whites. The particles and the snow, the way it cakes on everything from Jacob's suit to man-made structures, or alien structures for that matter, and biophages pretending to be frozen, and even the harsh elements like the strong wind and the never-ending barrage of lightning. Admittedly, the landscape is a bit too reminiscent of Dead Space 3, which might not be the ideal memory you want to evoke from most Dead Space fans, but rather than just mimicking that game, Callisto feels like it did with its moon what Dead Space 3 should have done, give it a sense of isolation. The later sections in the game is where the art direction falls a little bit on the generic side. You've got the usual caves with that muddy brown filter, lots of rusted sheets of metal, and everything just feels a little bit too samey. I don't really mind the way it looks, to be honest. Glen Schofield is known to pay homage to horror film classics. He's made that abundantly clear. Dead Space was an homage to the 1997 horror film Event Horizon, and the second half of Callisto seems to pay homage to the 2005 cult classic The Descent. Callisto even throws a super high-tech sci-fi lab at the end as a nod to the ones in Resident Evil. But unlike the RE labs, this place is far from dull-looking and bears more of a resemblance to Art Deco lounges and even games like Atomic Heart and Echo. Jacob and Danny were suffering from hallucinations throughout the game and kept seeing this mysterious purple glowing box, a hex box. It sort of works like a MacGuffin plot device similar to the marker from Dead Space, and given the hexagonal patterns all over the place, it turns out the hex box was a foreshadowing of this place all along. Let's move on to the animations. Jacob Lee is one of the best animated protagonists I've ever seen. Even as a full package, Callisto has most certainly the best animation quality in survival horror. That is, of course, unless you consider The Last of Us 2 as a survival horror game, which, personally, I'm on the fence about that one. Jacob doesn't exactly run like the wind, if you catch my drift, but I feel like it works in favor of what the game's going for. Consider some of the factors at hand here. Jacob is a severely injured pilot, fresh out of a spaceship crash, traumatized by the death of his best friend, almost got himself killed sticking a holographic chip in his neck, is a walking 6-foot-plus tower of muscle and stubbornness, and on top of all that, is a 42-year-old dude who has to pace himself from all the abdominal cramps he's about to get from the sidestepping, dodging, and baton swinging over the long distances he will have to cover over the course of the game. If you asked me if Jacob was too slow for this game a few weeks ago, my answer would have been drastically different than the one I'm about to give you. No. Jacob is as fast and as strong as he needs to be, and he strikes a balance between looking realistic and badass most of the time. The animation of Jacob running down a flight of stairs has got to be the coolest way someone's ever run down a flight of stairs in a video game. The vault animation is a bit slow, but it really conveys that sense of weight to Jacob's character and his suit, and it adds just the right amount of tension, especially in boss battles. It's simply flawless. What's not flawless is how the animations transition from one to the next, unlike the segue I just made. If you don't subscribe now, you never will. Transitions in this game do not feel finished, and I'm not just talking about the animations either. This is an issue in another area that I'll bring up later. There are many moments in this game that just come to a crawl, and I mean that literally. Jacob spends an absurd amount of time crawling through vents, squeezing through gaps, and ducking under pipes. And we get it, it's not just a way to mask loading screens anymore. Apparently, it's mainly used for pacing and gameplay reasons, such as spacing out the time taken between two separate levels for some greater dramatic effect, and most likely to disincentivize you from backtracking, among other things. But there's gotta be a better, less tedious way than this. The animations themselves in a vacuum, slow as they may be, look really good, but the way the game cuts from one sequence to another is not as smooth as it could be. The death scenes have it even worse. The game has a tendency of jump cutting to a pre-rendered animation scene that does not align with the way Jacob had just died 2 seconds prior. Since we're on that topic, and I'm quite vocal about the importance and impact of death scenes in survival horror games, I was somewhat disappointed by what Callisto had to offer, really. Where do I even begin? The monster designs I found to be really interesting despite the scope being limited to mostly humanoid characteristics. And that gore system they built for this game, that was brilliantly done. Whether it's Jacob bashing a biophage's head in or vice versa, the damage models built for these characters is amazing. You can actually use photo mode in the middle of combat and notice that melee attacks actually leave dents on the flesh. The most impressive part though is the biophage transformation. The game has to adapt to whichever enemy body part has been blown off, and it's really fascinating seeing a biophage not only transform into a more disgusting version of itself, but even regrow all of its missing limbs. It is somewhat unfortunate then that disgusting or gross is all they really are. Technically, this stuff does constitute as horror, it's known as the gross out, but it feels like it's missing one key ingredient. It simply isn't scary. In the Mastering Horror documentary series, Alec Gillis poses a really interesting question. When you make a character that has 2 arms, 2 legs, a head, and 2 eyes, you're building familiarity into it. Does that make it more or less scary? I feel as if this question, rhetorical or not, is the key to understanding why Callisto fails to evoke genuine horror. The mere act of making a monster look human is not enough to create that sense of familiarity. Glen Schofield explains that the idea behind the biophage is that the scariest thing to him is a deranged human being. I wouldn't necessarily disagree with that answer, it's more so that the game doesn't seem to understand what it is about a deranged human being that makes it so terrifying. I think what makes a deranged human terrifying is that there is still room for human intelligence, locked away below the primitive behavior it is operating through on the surface level. I think that's where the true horror is, in the unpredictability. Isn't that the whole point of The Walking Dead? That's why the real villains were the people and not the zombies. The intelligence of the human mind is what separates humans from other animals with intelligence of their own. Preserving that intelligence is such a high priority that it's even hardwired in us as a species, which is why seeing that intelligence fade away right before your eyes evokes such a strong feeling of fear. It's instinct. This is what the Callisto Protocol is missing from the equation. I'm going to bring up Dead Space here, not to highlight the similarities, rather the differences, to hammer home how 2 games that both share Glen Schofield's brand of sci-fi horror ended up with completely different results. Let me ask you this, what separates Dead Space and Callisto in the way that they conduct horror? I'd argue it's the way you witness the human mind lose control of itself. In Dead Space, you were a witness to the decay and deterioration of the human mind. People just slammed their heads against walls, gave up on what made them human, and did unspeakable things, both literally and figuratively, becoming something that is alien. Even when it comes to the death scenes, the most terrifying one in Dead Space is always the one where Isaac gets a head transplant, because you see him lose control over his mind and his body. You literally see another living organism take over his nervous system and he twitches in the process. That's horrifying. Intimacy and vulnerability of the human condition is what elevates a piece of fiction into a timeless horror classic. The lack of these specific elements is what permanently sentenced Callisto to be stranded in its shallowness. You simply never get to see a biophage struggle with its humanity. You get to see Dani battle her infection really late in the game, but you're not really seeing the horror and the agony behind the swollen eyes and the bloated flesh. It's really strange to see the melee combat take all the blame for why the horror does not work. I don't agree at all. Pitting the player against these creatures and forcing you to engage with them up close and personal is something we don't see enough in survival horror. Melee systems can always be worked into a horror game, that's not the real problem. Identifying the problem is as simple as deconstructing the building blocks of most horror fiction, which is exactly what you just heard in the last few minutes. For something so human-like, the biophage simply lacks all, well, humanity. Some of my viewers brought up the Condemned series in the comments, and to be honest, they couldn't have brought up a more perfect comparison. Condemned is a masterclass in horror through the use of AI designed to mimic human intelligence. Given it's the same studio that made Fear, a psychological horror FPS with the most convincing artificial intelligence probably ever, that is to be expected. We're talking AI so good, it's actually scary. It wasn't the focus on enemy aesthetic that made brawls in Condemned so nerve-wracking. It's that you never knew what these enemies could do next. The unpredictability of it all. Predictability leads to repetition, and repetition is the antithesis of horror. Because Callisto's enemies lack that sense of cunning and unpredictability, there's no questioning if the violence is the right choice, regardless of how human-like or familiar the monsters look. It just ends up feeling not even instinctive, just mindless. And I'm not saying this should be something the game should ask from you throughout the whole journey, but I think that if the game left room for such contemplation in the early stages, it could have evoked something far more personal and visceral. There's more to why the death scenes felt disappointing beyond the enemies not feeling scary. Even in a vacuum, they aren't much to write home about. There is a problem that's similar to The Evil Within, where the gore in most of the death scenes does not feel believable enough. What kills it for me, no pun intended, is that the dismemberment feels artificial. Regardless of whether we're talking about Jacob or the biophage, almost every death scene feels like watching some toy with detachable parts come off, rather than a believable character suffering the consequences of a horror story. You see this everywhere. If you shoot a biophage's leg off, it doesn't really look like you tore it off with bullets from a gun, it looks chopped off. And it's always the same points of contact, the elbows, the knees, the shoulders, and the neck. Bullet damage on these enemies should have looked more something like out of Resident Evil 2 Remake, where the bone and the flesh are slowly peeled off from each other, and then the limbs just slip off from the exact point where you shot them. It's sloppy and gross, and would have been a perfect fit for Callisto's gore system. This issue goes beyond the enemies themselves, it's more about how this affects Jacob's death scenes. Because the gore doesn't feel sloppy and fleshy enough for the level of graphical realism Callisto is obsessed with, there's a slight tonal dissonance, and it's hard to feel bad for Jacob in these instances. It also doesn't help that the death scenes become repetitive real quick. When the loading screens are this long and dying is this frequent, and the death animations always go down the same way, I'd say it's pretty easy to see why people lose interest after seeing a death scene after, like, I don't know, the first time. Thankfully, you could have always skipped them from the main menu, but now that the recent update gives you a prompt to just skip them, it sort of confirms that even the devs have realized that going all in on these death scenes and playing their hand too early by putting them in the promotional material wasn't the brightest idea. Overall, even with all the flaws, the presentation in Callisto is still superb. It misses the mark in lots of ways, but it's safe to say that graphics are the one aspect of Callisto that most will not hesitate to give it credit for. That Glen Schofield brand of ambience is still here, and it's still as captivating and cinematic as ever. The flickering of the lights was a little overdone in some specific rooms. I mean, we're talking about instances where you think to yourself, did they put an epilepsy warning for this stuff? But on the whole, the light and shadow at play is phenomenal, and it gets the atmosphere just right. A huge positive I might have glossed over are the mo-capped facial animations, which alongside the voice acting are by far the strongest contributors to this game's storytelling. These things have become so advanced that it's no wonder so many scriptwriters are relying so heavily on it to do most of their heavy lifting. Almost like a crutch. It's like you're looking at Death Stranding. You don't see a character, you're just seeing a real-life actor. Depending on who you ask, it's either a compliment or a detriment, but the realism that comes with it does offer some much-needed semblance of humanity. It's a good thing that the game at least gets that one layer of humanity right, because when it comes to the humanity that the game so desperately needs to sell you the horror, just isn't there. Okay, so let's get the voice acting out of the way first. The Callisto Protocol does have a story, and I'm sure it will resonate with some of the audience, but it didn't do anything for me. If I told you to picture Resident Evil's Umbrella Corporation, but in space, that's literally it. I'm just so tired of this one-dimensional, obvious evil company was obviously evil all along stuff. I don't know, it's just boring to me. In all fairness to Callisto, most survival horror stories are mediocre at best. Some of them do have a satisfying payoff, but on the whole, the writing isn't great. Which is a shame because horror games in general have some of the best written stories from any genre. We're talking games like Soma, the first 4 Silent Hill games, Detention. These are all contenders for the best video game stories ever told. But the thing is, none of them are survival horror. These are all psychological horror games, and unfortunately on the internet they get confused for survival horror games all the time. You could make a strong argument for Signalis though, which is easily the best horror story in years. But the more times I play it, the closer and closer I am to concluding that it's a psychological horror game. I'll talk about it more in the next video, which will be about Signalis. My enjoyment of Callisto's story has almost nothing to do with the writing or the plot, but with the efforts of the cast who lend their voices and appearances to the characters.
Back into Black Iron? No fucking way. We almost got killed just trying to get out of Black Iron.
This isn't about escape,
Then
Jacob.
what's it about?
Not anymore.
What's it about?
Answers! Why did the warden shoot down one of his own ships?
I don't know.
And how is it connected to Europa?
This is supposed to be just another fucking job. This is crazy.
Josh Duhamel is awesome as Jacob. I liked his performance in Call of Duty World War II. Frankly, he's the only good thing I even remember about that game. But his performance in Callisto is no less spectacular. He plays Jacob as if he's part Nathan Drake, part Deacon St. John. He mumbles to himself about where to go next, and his facial expressions whenever he's down on his luck are straight up hilarious. Oftentimes, Jacob feels like the "this is fine" meme personified, and I couldn't get enough of that perfect balance between seriousness and unintentional comedy. But hey, every survival horror franchise wants to have their own Ash Williams these days, and honestly, Jacob, or Josh Duhamel, could become that for this franchise. Karen Fukuhara gives a great performance as Denny Nakamura, and although I'm glad with the amount of screen time she gets, it is a shame how underutilized she feels at times. I enjoyed the evolution of her relationship with Jacob, from foes to partners to friends, but I feel like she becomes central to the narrative a bit too late, making the evolution of their friendship feel all too rushed.
Inmate 532-521. Dr. Caitlin Marler, and as per Article 412 of the UJC Penal Code, you will now be fitted with a core device.
The doctor, he's not in the system. We don't know.
Just prep the device.
What the fuck? That device!
Louise Barnes as Dr. Caitlin Mahler left an interesting reaction. Dr. Mahler is a character that is introduced in the beginning and then only shows up again at the end of the game. However, you will come across several voice recordings, and depending on whether you listen to them or not, you'll either piece most of the story together or miss almost all of it. And if you do decide to skip on those recordings, Dr. Mahler's appearance at the end can feel arbitrary and out of place. I wouldn't blame you though. Out of all the baffling decisions made for this game, the fact that you have to listen to these recordings from a menu that you cannot close instead of just picking them up and automatically play them out in real time is somehow the one that baffles me the most. How can a 16-year-old game like BioShock have the perfect formula for this handed on a silver platter, and a game from 2022 just goes, "Nah, who needs it?" Anyway, I did listen to all the recordings, including Dr. Mahler's, because woohoo, you get a trophy for that. And I do find it interesting that for once, there's a doctor that doesn't immediately die after some long exposition dump. Although you can't rule that one out yet for the sequel or DLC. Maybe I'm reading too deep into her character, but if we do get a follow-up, I am interested to see where the story takes her at least. James Mathis does a great job as the antagonist Warden Cole, but I didn't really enjoy the whole cliched mustache twirling, well, you and I are not so different, protagonist. We should totally work together vibe of it all. That's not an actor problem, by the way, that's a writing problem. Unfortunately, two wrongs don't make a right. The main antagonist might be Warden Cole, but the main villain is Mr. Captain Swole over here. Sam Witwer plays Captain Leon Ferris, and he's barely in this game. He's in it for a whopping total of, I don't know, 5 minutes. Then he just simply disappears, only to show up right at the end. And yet, he stole the show.
You know they call Callisto the dead moon. Dead. Just like you would have been if I hadn't fished you out of that wreck. Oh, 5, 2, 1. Look at me when I'm talking to you. What'd you do? Huh? You can tell me. Are you different? Are you special? Why'd the warden want you alive? There's always a prize to pay.
You can just feel he was having a blast with this character. Like many others, I wish Ferris had a lot more screen time. The game practically ends on the signature Schofield jump-scare type of ending, which implies that Ferris is either still alive or will return as one of Jacob's hallucinations. However, I don't really appreciate how heavy-handed the sequel bait is here, and I'm not just talking about Ferris. My personal favorite performance in the game comes from Zeke Alton as Elias Porter, a prisoner who knows black iron like the back of his hand and seizes the opportunity to escape with the help of Danny and Jacob. I find Elias's character to offer the most narrative complexity within the Callisto Protocol. I was so looking forward to see how this friendship, or perhaps even rivalry with Jacob, would grow over time. There was this sense of unease and curiosity between the two, and unfortunately, Elias simply got killed off halfway through the game. In fact, that death scene is actually the only part of Callisto's story that evoked any sort of emotion out of me. Not because the moment was earned, but because of how good the performances are.
I'll get you to cover. Come on. Yes, you can. not that far. It's not that far. Come on. No, no. Hey, gotta keep going. We gotta keep going. Come on.
No, bro. I'm done. Thank you. It's because of you. Look out.
I'll see you on the other side.
I don't know what it is about these couple of sentences that really moved me, but they feel so genuinely acted out that they truly sell the moment for me. The greatest horror moment in the Callisto Protocol happened right here. Not with a jump scare, not with loud noises, but with subtlety, tragedy, and irony. There is more power in seeing Elias die in the freezing cold the moment he escapes than in every other moment combined. And that is what makes it the best scene in the game. Out of all the reviews I've seen on the Callisto Protocol, it almost feels as if not a single one has talked about the unconventional madness that is the way Callisto's sound was composed. The Callisto Protocol soundtrack will probably not be remembered for how it stands out, but for how it does not. Instead of a traditional soundtrack mixed in with some ambient music tracks, Callisto uses an instrument called the Apprehension Engine. Now, the Apprehension Engine is a sort of a Frankenstein's monster of a machine, and it's mostly used to compose music for horror films. Apparently, Striking Distance had one of these engines custom built just for them to use in their games. The engine was invented by film music composer Mark Corvin and guitar maker Tony Duggan Smith. After working with digital samples of music and sound effects, Corvin expressed how limited and repetitive the samples started to feel after a while, and so he reached out to Duggan Smith to create an instrument that is tailor-made for him, something that can recreate the same sounds with an added layer of acoustics and the touch of human imperfection, or if you're glass half full, a touch of spontaneity, originality, and life. I never actually saw or heard of the Apprehension Engine until I started doing some research on Callisto a few days ago. I've never seen anything like it. It's such an eccentric looking instrument. I mean, some of this thing's parts consist of metal rulers, strings, an ebow, a reverb tank, and even some sort of metal rods that seem to spring up and down in intervals, almost as if they behave like a metronome. I'm not a music guru or anything. I'm sure I'm missing some of its bells and whistles. I just wish I could find some more information on this thing. It is possible this engine's been used before in some other games. I've seen speculations of it being used in Tomb Raider, but I found nothing to confirm that. Anyway, to give you the TLDR, the purpose of the Apprehension Engine is to create music using the most unpleasant sounds imaginable. It's not music in a conventional sense, but composer Corvin seems to define it as music because it produces sound that evokes some sort of emotion. I guess when you put it that way, you could argue that it does constitute as music. So, am I a fan of Callisto's music? I'm not so sure that I am, but do I appreciate the complexity that goes into how it's produced? Oh yeah, absolutely. I think the problem that musicians will face with the Apprehension Engine is that it's designed to be inherently spontaneous and can work against itself. The artistry is undoubtedly fascinating though. The music is so rooted in the use of unpleasant sounds instead of formulaic melodies that they give off the illusion that it's a diegetic sound coming from the horrific world established within that of the movie or the video game itself. And that can be a double-edged sword. Its diegetic-esque quality can make it extremely immersive, which can feel unsettling in a more natural way than the typical soundtrack, but on the other hand, the line between music and ambient noise becomes so blurred, you can't tell where the latter ends and the former begins. I know that it sounds like a backhanded compliment, but I'm not sure that's what I'm getting at here. I honestly don't know whether the fact that it doesn't stand out is an insult, or whether it's a compliment because it's supposed to blend in with the rest of the soundscape. Either way, it's fascinating. The biggest problem with Callisto's sound design is the same problem that Dead Space 1 suffered from. This game just wants to sound scary, not most of the time, but all of the time. In terms of tone and sense of dread, it feels relentless to a fault. Some like it, others don't. I fall in the latter camp more or less. I believe horror needs room to breathe to truly work. It needs to make use of some negative space. The horror genre works kind of like a bow. It requires two opposing forces for it to work properly as a tool. It needs to pull and then release. If you take that as a horror metaphor, it's tension and relief. They juxtapose one another, and that's the issue that seems to permeate through Glen Schofield's horror games. The whole point of applying tension to a bow is so that the arrow is taken to a new place, not where it already was. It needs to juxtapose itself with something contradictory or ironic, like feelings of comedic relief or levity or even melancholy, to truly hammer the scares home. You can never appreciate the value of darkness without light, and in Callisto's case, of fear without levity and noise without serenity. If all of it is scary, then none of it is scary. So here we are, the most divisive part of the Callisto Protocol, the gameplay. You might want to sit down with a glass of milk for this one, because this is gonna be one spicy hot take. I'm about to say something that many will never admit. We did not play the Callisto Protocol the way it was intended to be played. Hold on, I said we, not you. That includes me. I made just as many mistakes in my first playthrough. When I say we played it wrong, I'm not saying it's a skill issue. I'm saying it's an awareness issue. In its first week of launch, Callisto had tons of trouble getting the combat to work properly, which made it seem brutally unfair. Just to be clear, that is the game's fault, not the player's fault. But with the patches installed, I don't understand why it's still getting dunked on. This system actually works. I'm not even trying to imply that the combat is flawless or anything like that, but the root of the problem isn't the system itself, it's how poorly explained it is. I want to ask you a question. If the combat system does a poor job of explaining itself, does that actually mean that the system is bad? Consider this. We live in a time where Dark Souls, Bloodborne, and Elden Ring, some of my favorite games ever made, are constantly showered with praise on the internet for never holding anyone's hand. We all look back at Demon Souls and just laugh at the idea that back in 2009, someone at Sony unironically thought that Demon Souls had a terrible combat system. Turns out it was simply misunderstood. So why is it then that the Callisto Protocol, a game that has secretly one of the most fun and intense melee systems of any survival horror game, isn't getting the same benefit of the doubt even now with all the patches? How is this any different to when people thought Demon Souls was terrible in 2009? If there's one thing most people hate in this world, it's something we don't understand yet. Or in other words, change. That's the Callisto Protocol gameplay in a nutshell. Everyone is so preoccupied about what Callisto is doing with its combat that nobody ever seems to stop and ask why. We all just go, hey look guys, look at what Callisto's doing. It plays like a mix of Dead Space, The Last of Us, and Punch-Out. When what we should be asking is, why does it play like Dead Space, The Last of Us, and Punch-Out? The only what that actually matters is what new ideas can this unusual blend of mechanics bring to survival horror games. During the marketing, Striking Distance put out a really bold statement that I still think about to this day. That statement says,
We evolved the combat and for survival horror.
in one specific way, it kinda did do that. I think that Callisto's greatest achievement isn't its execution, but that it reopened the age-old survival horror question once more. What stands out about Callisto, once you understand what the combat is trying to do, is how it defies all of the popular misconceptions about the genre. It already happened with Resident Evil 4, and it's happening again now. We've convinced ourselves that you're supposed to play passively in survival horror, and that's not even true in most old-school games. Those are viable options, but not necessities. Callisto Protocol proves this exact point even further by not giving you the ability to run away and still give you plenty of options to use in a fight. What it's asking of you is to get rid of the bad habits you've developed from old school survival horror games and the bad habits that video essays have beaten you over the head with. It is asking you to stop hoarding so much useless ammo, to stop being so passive, and to stop for a moment to truly reflect on what the words survival horror mean. This genre is not about running away, it's about facing your fears. It's about taking action and being assertive. You're a survivor, not a wimp. The secret to winning in the Callisto Protocol is to understand that it wants you to stand your ground. Back when the game launched, my opinion used to be that the combat was fine when it was one-on-one, but it fell apart in the end game when you had to fight several of them at once. The dodge move is deceptively simple, so much so that it's easy to underestimate. The tension doesn't actually come from timing the dodges, but from how fast you can react to switching directions as fast as possible when you get surrounded. To make matters worse, Callisto was so badly optimized at launch that even successful dodges weren't being registered by the game, resulting in plenty of game over screens that were simply uncalled for. My first run was so miserable that even for such a short and sweet linear experience, it felt like it had worn out its welcome 2/3 of the way in. The patches literally made all the difference in the world, because my opinion has changed significantly since that run. Not only did I understand how I was playing it wrong, but the constant patches and updates were drastically facilitating that learning process. When working as intended, the Callisto Protocol's combat is a lot better designed than it gets credit for. While the one-on-one brawls are still fine, it's actually when you are pitted against entire groups that things get really interesting. Take a look at this. This is one of the most dangerous rooms to get ambushed in the entire game, and as you will see here, you can handle all 6 or 7 of them at once without ever needing to run away. I used the few seconds I have to spare to lure them over to the spiked wall, but since throwing them into it would leave me vulnerable for a hit, I decide to stand my ground and face them head on. The trick here is to always be ready to change the direction of your dodging. Even if you get flanked from behind, just keep switching directions until the one in front of you finishes their attack. That is your cue to start swinging. Callisto plays as a brawler first and a shooter second. Ranged weapons function more or less like in a spaghetti western. Jacob is meant to be role-played as a space cowboy, quick-shotting the enemies for a critical hit or tearing off a biophage's knees to dish out a free insta-kill. Once it comes down to a one-on-one fight, it's time to lure the last biophage back to the spiked wall. Telekinesis is a precious resource on maximum difficulty and it shouldn't be wasted in such circumstances, so I played a long game here. The biophage is positioned just where I wanted, and I use the heavy attack to catapult it straight into the spikes. I've only shown you one instance where this works, but every overwhelming situation that isn't a boss fight can and should be tackled this way. Running away is so antithetical to the philosophy of Callisto that some corridors evenly space out their enemy spawn points to de-incentivize you from trying to bypass every enemy. There's no way this wasn't intentional on the developer's part, because if you go down that same corridor and pick them off one by one, your odds of surviving increase exponentially. This is basically the same philosophy used in the Dark Souls games, and I know you're tired of the Dark Souls comparisons, but unlike the Dead Space comparisons everyone else has wasted time on, this is a comparison that actually makes sense. In an interview with Wired, Elden Ring came up in the discussion for Callisto Protocol and how difficult games are currently the trend. Does anyone really think that question wasn't handpicked for the interview, specifically on the grounds of it being relevant to the game? It's a staged interview, of course it was relevant. For those of you who enjoy survival horror games but maybe not Souls-likes, I strongly recommend reevaluating some things. These two genres have so much in common, and they only get more similar as the years go by. Games like Bloodborne, especially, blurred the lines between the two so much that I'm surprised no one's ever thought about discussing whether we're talking about two separate genres here or actually two distinct sides of the same coin. Shinji Mikami, the co-creator of Resident Evil and the godfather of survival horror, defines the genre as the one where fear and exhilaration coincide. Bloodborne, like Resident Evil 4 before it, is the epitome of that definition and is the quintessential survival horror game that no one ever seems to talk about. And we should, because I don't know if you've noticed, but AAA survival horror games have been obsessed with striving to the level of Bloodborne for 7 years. Bloodborne drew inspiration from Resident Evil 4, and then Resident Evil 3 and Village returned the favor by drawing inspiration from Bloodborne. Callisto also draws heavy inspiration from the same well, not when it comes to presentation, but when it comes to gameplay and philosophy of difficulty. By incentivizing the player to cautiously single enemies out one by one. Jacob is also as powerful as the standard biophage, the same way the hunter is as powerful as every other common fodder enemy. Your guns act as a parry or a critical hit instead of turning the game into a shooter. Some enemies can transform and there's only a small window of opportunity to prevent that from happening. Both games also have mechanics or incentives to engage in close quarters combat. The only real difference in their philosophy is their pacing. Bloodborne is maniacal in its franticism. There's so much going on at times and it all happens so fast that it's impossible at times to not need a breather. And so the game allows you to create distance between foes, but not for long. Survival horror is about risk versus reward, and Bloodborne is all about that tenfold. Instead of punishing you for running away like in Callisto, Bloodborne instead rewards you for staying in close proximity and trading blows by restoring portions of your health meter. We can look at this type of player conditioning as positive reinforcement, kind of like it's patting you on the back for playing like an absolute Chad. In comparison, Callisto's risk versus reward system is much slower paced. The more comparable From Software game would be Dark Souls 2, where every healing Estus flask was so slow and precious that it served more of a health top-up before a fight began rather than to be used in the middle of one. We can then consider this method as negative reinforcement. It denies you of the liberty to make what the game considers to be bad decisions, whereas the other method gives you the liberty to miss out on good ones. In other words, FOMO. I don't believe it's a coincidence that both critics and players hated Dark Souls 2 and Callisto for the way their gameplay and difficulty works. The negative reinforcement is the mutual link, the same philosophy that fuels both games, and I suspect that's what put both games under so much scrutiny. That's one way of looking at what Callisto is doing, and it is possible to see it through that lens at first, but there is a second way to look at it. We can also think of Callisto as a slower version of Doom Eternal. Doom Eternal could be viewed from the same two lenses as Callisto. You can look at it as a game that is boring for not letting you play it how you want, or as a game that constrains you specifically to push you into the fun zone. It is essentially negative reinforcement, same as Dark Souls 2 and Callisto. But what separates Doom from these two titles is the perception around it. Doom Eternal received tons of praise not because it handles difficulty any better, but because its community understands what it's trying to do. Callisto can be viewed in the exact same way. The old-school survival horror mentality will only lead to the path of most resistance. But if you play ball and meet the game on its terms, you're allowing the game to shape and mold an experience you might not even know you wanted to begin with. The fun zone. Now with that said, does this automatically mean that Callisto is always fair and the simple answer always boils down to get good? Absolutely not. Callisto has a fair share of inconsistencies. All games that are difficult but fair can have issues such as luck or RNG from time to time, but they usually compensate for that by bringing an extremely polished experience. Callisto unfortunately isn't as polished as it could be, even if the experience has solid mechanics and an addicting gameplay loop. Let's start out with the weapons. You have your primary weapon, the stun baton. You have your standard firearms, 2 handguns, 2 shotguns, and an assault rifle. You also have a shift for stealth attacks and a telekinesis glove known as the grip. The starting handgun, the hand cannon, is a phenomenal weapon. It's probably the best, most well-rounded weapon in the game. It packs real punch, it looks great in photo mode, the gunshots sound awesome, it has that perfect blend of futuristic laser sounds mixed with that realistic punch of something like the pistols from The Last of Us Part 2. and overall it's just a ridiculously powerful sidearm. The riot gun is the shotgun you are given halfway through, and it's a pretty generic shotgun for how futuristic it looks. Thankfully, looks aren't everything in a video game because the gunshot sound is a beast. Probably better than any shotgun from the past 4 Resident Evil games. The sound is meaty, well-rounded, and even has a metallic, almost like the sound of a laser beam just layered on top. And with headphones plugged in, not only do the echo and the reverb have a nice fade out to it all, you can actually hear all of it equally disperse out into the far distance. And that little detail goes a long way. The alternative is a sawn-off shotgun known as the skunk gun. Quite the ironic name, given that for something named after a creature with a repellent smell, this weapon sure smelled like a good idea. The capacity isn't great, but the narrow spread makes it extremely powerful and precise. And the reloading animation on this thing is as if striking distance heard the expression, "badasses don't look at explosions," and then decided that their version of such a badass would be a weapon named after a garbage magnet. If you're having difficulty with finding enough credits to upgrade your weapons, I wouldn't say it's worth the trouble, but if you've already mastered the gameplay and you just want to be the baddest space cowboy in town, well, this is it, chief. When it comes to ironic names though, the skunk gun has got nothing on the tactical pistol. The name is so ironic that I wouldn't be surprised if it was meant to be a joke, because that's all this weapon is. If you want the most power per capita, the hand cannon is the better option. And if you're going for speed over damage, the assault rifle is a significantly better investment. The only way the tactical pistol would ever come in handy is if you plan to have it and the riot gun as your main loadout. The only problem is, it's never gonna be worth the trouble. The alternate fire mode on the tactical pistol is embarrassingly underwhelming for how expensive it is. And honestly, even though the other weapons have much better unlockable firing modes, they're all too similar to one another. The skunk gun and the assault rifle give you homing bullets, while the hand cannon and riot gun just shoot fire bullets. They're nice to have, sure, but they're anticlimactic. The riot gun's not even around for half the game, and the tactical pistol is only obtainable near the end. By that point, you could have nicely upgraded the baton, the hand cannon, and the skunk gun. To make things worse, there's no way to sell any of the weapons you don't plan to use, which means that if you buy all of the weapon schematics, you are decreasing the odds of finding ammo for the weapons you have invested upgrades in. And then you'll have to sell the ammo you don't want to buy the ammo you do want, which is ridiculous. Take my advice. If it's your first playthrough, do not buy this weapon. I'd even go as far as to say ignore the skunk gun as well, just focus on the riot gun. But that much I'll leave it to you. Honestly, while the combat loop itself feels well executed, the weapon balancing and progression feel like the total opposite. When a game pivots this hard around melee combat, and it starts to introduce endgame bosses that can only be taken down with ranged weapons, it's a dead giveaway that not all of the mechanics were well thought out here. If your only option for melee in a melee-based game is to cheese the fight, that is not a good boss fight. I don't even hate the two-head monster, it's my favorite design in the game. I know it's not saying much given the limited enemy variety. You got the skinny bro, the chubby bro, the acid bro, the helmet bro, the nada bro, the no thanks bro, the Terminator bro, and the dude bro. But I kinda did like Two-Head. I just wish there was more to it instead of just recycling the same boss 4 times in a row at the end, especially when you consider that it doesn't even have a complicated moveset to begin with. I'll give credit where credit is due, and I will say the boss fights are super intense, or rather, were intense. Ever since patch 1.08 made swapping animations faster, that sense of dread and anxiety has lessened quite a bit. I'm not against the patches, I just don't think the time it took to swap was the real problem if you played it smart. My biggest personal gripe was having to press 2 buttons just to start the darn animation. In a boss fight where I can't afford to stop running, but have to take my thumb off the left thumbstick not to only press the D-pad, but then have to follow it up with a second button press, that's just counterintuitive game design. I also don't think the faster healing speed was the right call. The slow healing speed made you think twice about how it should be used, and because it was so unreliable during fights, you were conditioned to not depend on it, which can lead you to considering selling it for currency. Now that the animation is sped up and more comfortable to use, players are now going to prioritize their health items instead of the far more important Callisto credits. Not to mention, it's going to make wasting credits on healing items themselves at the workbench even more enticing. This is not even remotely an elitist or gatekeeping complaint. This is about how the game itself is now encouraging short-term rewards that do not outweigh the cost of long-term long-term mistakes. With that said, let's circle back to the last but certainly not the least of the weapons, the baton. While I adore this thing and love how reliable it is for the majority of the game, it is kind of baffling how a game with melee at the forefront only gives you one weapon to mess around with. Now granted, lore-wise it makes enough sense, and they really went hard with this weapon. This thing slaps harder than Will Smith at the Oscars, and it clubs harder than Rob Dugan's remix in The Matrix. The sound mixing and design of this weapon is simply incredible. It's like a combination of a lightsaber and a crowbar, and when it makes contact with a biophage, you can just feel the sizzling electricity as it tears off every last one of them standing in the way. It's amazingly disgusting and disgustingly amazing. Even some of the upgrades are amazing too. The damage upgrade changes the color of the electricity from blue to red, and if you want the best upgrade in the game, get the block breaker. It changes the game. There's no denying this stuff is great and all, but I wanted more. I wanted the baton upgrades to visually alter the appearance, not just the electricity. But I also wanted more than just one baton for the whole game. Adding at least one or two more melee options could have added so much more replayability even without a new game plus, which should be out next month by the way. I would have loved if instead of just finding a stun baton lying around, Jacob would have stumbled upon some sort of armory and had to decide from a selection of weapons which one he wants to commit to. I also don't understand why Jacob doesn't keep the crowbar from the start of the game. I understand if it wouldn't fit the aesthetic of the suit and all that, but they could have just changed the crowbar's aesthetic or make it eventually fit the aesthetic through some upgrades. Everything else seems to look different in the future. The stun baton's range is quite limited, and the crowbar could have been the long-range alternative, which could have come real handy for those bosses. It's a shame that it was just a copy and paste of the baton, just without the cool factor. That's about it for the combat, but there's one more thing I'd like to address. I wasn't really a fan of how on rails the game felt. I'm not saying there's no exploration at all, there is, or that there's anything wrong with linear game design. There isn't. This game's about as linear as Resident Evil 4, and if you are familiar with the channel, you know that I love Resident Evil 4 more than almost every other game that ever existed. But that was in 2005. We're in 2023 now, and living in a time where a high percentage of AAA games feel too homogenized and creatively bankrupt. The obsession with graphical fidelity at the cost of interactivity and player choice has been lost on consumers a long time ago. There's no point in video games trying to be movies anymore. We already know they can be more than that. I'll admit though that I have no one to blame for my disappointment other than myself. I think that when it came to the level design, I simply had the wrong expectations. I guess in a way that's a compliment to the game, because Black Iron Prison is such a cool setting and the secret locations make it even more interesting, that I just wish it had an expanded, more Metroidvania-style level design. A place where I could get lost exploring off the beaten path, looking for all kinds of environmental storytelling and rewards that I couldn't find otherwise. I guess what I'm trying to say is that I didn't want Black Iron Prison to just be another setting. I wanted it to feel like an important character. But I'll leave it there. The gameplay had lots of missed opportunities, there's no denying that, but when it gets things right, it gets things really right. For a game that feels straight out of the 7th gen in terms of how it plays things safe with its level design, Callisto sure made some bold moves when it came to shaking things up in the survival horror combat department. And not gonna lie, that's a breath of fresh air. This is why we need people like Glen Schofield making AAA survival horror games. Resident Evil hasn't had any real competitors in the last few years. Healthy competition's the only way the big names in survival horror will ever be forced to evolve and improve, and it's about time we as fans start seeing some real innovation. The Callisto Protocol hasn't perfectly executed its ideas by any stretch of the imagination, but it wasn't afraid to try something new, and more importantly, it has reopened the discussion on what survival horror games could be. That's more than anyone can say about every other survival horror game in recent memory. It's been interesting to see how quickly my opinion shifted on the Callisto Protocol. Within a span of a few days and updates, I went from feeling like I'm dragging myself to the finish line to feeling like I can't get enough of the gameplay loop and the satisfying visual and audio feedback. I don't give games numbered scores per se because they mean absolutely nothing when it comes to recommending, well, anything, but I do like to give a numbered rating on how much I enjoyed my time with a game. By the time this video goes up, I'll have finished the Callisto Protocol anywhere from 4 to 6 times. The combat is just that fun. So my first playthrough was so unpleasant and disappointing that it sat at about 4 out of 10 on my enjoyment scale. And since first impressions are an extremely important factor in this discussion, I cannot recommend this game at full price if you don't know what you're getting into. That's why I covered so many of its aspects in so much depth. However, if I had to rate all my playthroughs after that first abysmal run, after I got to learn and understand how to truly get the most out of the Callisto Protocol, every single run after that feels like a good 8 out of 10. The Callisto Protocol's poor launch was unfortunate to say the least. It is what it is, but I hope this does not discourage Glen Schofield and the Striking Distance team, and I hope this serves as a learning experience as they continue to make more and hopefully even better survival horror games. I don't know if the Callisto Protocol is good enough to warrant a sequel. It goes way too far with the sequel bait, way too far, but at the same time it offers a glimpse of greater things that could have been. And whether the next thing in the pipeline is a sequel that reaches its true potential, a DLC expansion, or a brand new experience built from scratch, I'm just happy we're getting more horror games, and I can't wait to see where the studio goes from here. The Callisto Protocol may not have been the sci-fi masterpiece everyone was waiting for, but it could be the start of something greater. And that something greater was so close, you could say it was within striking distance. And with that, the Raven draws to a conclusion. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.